There are stories the earth itself tries to forget. Stories buried beneath the roots of trees older than any living man. Their bark sealing over the memory like a wound that refuses to heal. This is one of them. When they found her, she was barefoot in the snow, the hem of her dress soaked red. Her wedding veil had frozen to her hair, strands of it snapping like brittle thread. When the sheriff pulled it away, she kept whispering one name, Dalton, but no one knew who that was. The year was 1947, and the war had been over for almost 2 years. But for her, it had never ended. She had walked 20 miles through the hills, carrying something wrapped in linen. When they unwrapped it, they found the small, grey body of a baby. It wasn't the cold that had killed it. Its lungs had never filled. No doctor had cut its cord. No preacher had spoken its name. The body had been born into silence and carried out of it the same way. The coroner in Jackson called her the bride, because she still wore the white lace dress. The local paper refused to print the photograph. It wasn't decency that stopped them. It was pity. Because her face didn't look human anymore. The eyes were empty sockets of shock, the mouth half open. As if she'd been caught mid-confession. The file that held her name, Opel Pritchard, was closed within a week. The official cause of death for the child, asphyxia of indeterminate origin. The cause of her collapse, exhaustion, no further inquiry, no next of kin. The sheriff marked the file unresolved and moved on. But in the years that followed, people in Breathitt County still whispered about the girl in the white dress who came out of the woods, carrying her own sin in her arms. They said she came from a place that doesn't appear on any map. A patch of land where the same 12 names had repeated for generations. They said her blood was too thick, her family too close, her story too old to tell without choking on it. And they said that when she looked up at the sky that night, before she fell into the snow, she wasn't praying for salvation. She was asking why she had been born at all. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? If you trace the river that runs behind the old coal road south of Jackson, you'll find where the maps end. The terrain folds into itself, ridges collapsing like the ribs of something dead, too long to recognize. Locals call it Pritchard Hollow, though no sign bears the name anymore. It's not a town, never was. Just a cluster of rotting farmhouses swallowed by trees, a graveyard with no fence, and soil that's been fed by the same blood for over 100 years. The first record of them appears in an 1827 land deed, filed under the name of Ezekiel Pritchard, a war veteran granted 300 acres for service he never rendered. No census lists him afterward. No marriage, no burial. But the land stayed in the family, passed from father to son, uncle to niece, brother to sister, like a curse no one had the courage to end. By the time the Civil War ended, the Pritchards had already begun turning inward. They didn't call it sin. They called it preservation. They believed the blood carried something sacred, something not meant for outsiders. Theirs was a faith not written in scripture, but in the deformities of their children, born twisted, tongueless, blind. They said God was testing them, that each defect was a mark of divine favor. The world outside called it madness. The farm was a kingdom of rot. 3 houses built from the same felled oak, a barn that sagged like a dying beast, and a chapel with no steeple, just a wooden cross carved from an old bed frame. Inside, they kept records in a ledger older than any living member names. Births, deaths, marriages, all written in the same hand. The ink fading to brown, the paper stiff from the oil of too many fingers. The lines looped back on themselves, generation after generation, until the family tree resembled more a noose than a lineage. By 1900, not a single Pritchard had married outside the bloodline in over 60 years, and by 1930, the government had stopped sending census takers altogether. The last one, a man named Harold McClellan, had returned shaken, claiming the children looked wrong, their faces blank, their speech half-formed, their eyes too pale. He quit 2 weeks later, moved to Ohio, and never spoke of Breathitt County again. It was there, in the hollow left behind by that silence, that Opel Ruth Pritchard was born in 1928, the 9th of 12 children. Her mother, Ruth, had been married to her uncle since she was 14. Her father's name was written twice in the ledger, once as husband, once as brother. The house she was born in had no mirrors. The Pritchards didn't believe in reflection. They said it was how the devil found his way in. When Opel turned 12, her grandfather told her she would marry soon. He didn't ask her. He told her. And that's where this story truly begins. They said the wedding was quiet. No preacher from town, no music, no witnesses beyond the family. Just the dull hum of summer cicadas and the sound of an old clock ticking in a house that never saw sunlight. It was 1941. The same week America entered the war. While the rest of the country sent its sons across the ocean, the Pritchards married theirs to their nieces. Opel Ruth Pritchard, 13 years old, stood barefoot in a white dress sewn from her grandmother's curtains. Across from her stood Dotton Pritchard, 15, her cousin twice over, mother's nephew and father's blood. He was born with a clubbed foot and a jaw too small for his skull. When he spoke, the words came out thick, like his tongue was too heavy for his mouth. But he didn't speak much, not that day, not ever. They exchanged no vows, just a nod from the grandfather who stood in place of God, declaring what had already been decided before either child had drawn breath. That night, the door to their room was locked from the outside. Opel remembered the sound of it more than anything, the click of the bolt sliding home, the soft breath of her new husband trembling in the dark. She didn't understand what was expected of her, only that it would hurt, and that she was supposed to be silent when it did. By the time the war reached its second year, Opel had buried her first child, a stillborn girl with a neck marked by the cord that had killed her. The baby was never named. Her grandmother told her that naming the dead made them restless. They buried her in the Pritchard Cemetery, a small hill behind the chapel, where the headstones all bore the same last name. Her second baby came the following year, a boy. He breathed for 16 hours, his chest rattling like a broken machine. They called him Samuel, after a name that had repeated for 5 generations, and then buried him beside his sister. Opel didn't cry. No one did. Her grandmother only said, "The blood's testing you." Next one hold. The next one didn't hold. Neither did the one after. By 1944, Opel's body had begun to fail her. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her teeth loosened in her gums. She was 15 years old and carried the weight of 4 pregnancies in a frame that barely reached 90 pounds. But she was still considered useful, a vessel that hadn't yet broken completely. Her husband, Dalton, had stopped looking at her. He slept in the barn most nights, his club foot dragging through the dirt like a shovel blade. Sometimes, Opel would hear him muttering to himself, the words lost to the dark, something between a prayer and a curse. In the family's records, those years were marked not by events but by losses. Birth after birth, death after death, the same names repeating like a spell recited too often to still mean anything. And then came 1945. The war ended. The world celebrated. And somewhere in those hills, Opel Pritchard became pregnant again. When the war ended, the hollows fell silent. The radio in the old Pritchard home had long since stopped working. But word drifted through the hills like smoke, whispers that men were coming home, that bombs had fallen, that the world outside had changed. But nothing changed in Pritchard Hollow. The air still smelled of damp wood and rot. The same creak still wound past the graves, and Opel, 16 now, found herself sick again. The way she always was before a child came. Her grandmother told her it was a blessing, that the blood had finally settled right. The women of the family gathered around her as if preparing a ritual, boiling water, folding linens, whispering over her belly. No one spoke Dalton's name. He had left months before, wandering into the woods with a rifle and never returning. Some said he'd gone to fight, though he'd never been drafted. Others said the hills had taken him, as they often did those born of too much kin. In his absence, Opel's grandfather became the head of the house again, a man whose eyes were pale as milk, whose voice carried the weight of scripture, twisted beyond redemption. He told her the child was pure, born not from sin but from divine design. Blood don't spoil when it's chosen, he'd whisper. Eat refines. That winter was the coldest in 50 years. The walls of the house wept frost, and the hens froze on their roosts. Opel slept in the same bed where she had been wed, her body swollen, her breath shallow. The others prayed outside her door each night, chanting hymns warped into something unrecognizable. When the pains began, it wasn't screams that filled the house but silence, a suffocating quiet that made the boards of the floor creak louder than voices. She labored for a full day, the child refusing to come. When it finally did, it came out twisted, the cord wound 3 times around its neck, its skin gray, its eyes sealed. The grandmother lifted it by the ankles, slapped it once, twice, and the thing took a breath. But that sound wasn't a cry. It was something else, a dry rasp, like air forced through broken glass. The women crossed themselves. One began to sob. Opel, weak and delirious, reached for her baby, but they didn't hand it to her. The grandfather stepped forward instead, looked down at the infant, and said, "The Lord's hand is still on this one." They wrapped it in linen and carried it away. Opel never saw where they went. For 3 days, she lay in bed, her body hollowed, her mind adrift in fever. When she woke, the house was empty. No footsteps, no voices. Only the faint scent of smoke outside, rising from the hill behind the chapel. She knew then where they had taken her child, and when she tried to stand, her legs gave out beneath her, but something in her refused to die. So she crawled, through the doorway, through the snow, toward the smell of burning linen. The night was so black it swallowed the moon. Snow fell in thick, slow sheets, and the smoke drifting from the hilltop glowed faintly orange in the dark, like a wound in the sky. Opel crawled through it, her hands tearing open on the ice, her knees leaving thin trails of blood in the snow. The pain didn't matter. She followed the smell, the sweet, sick scent of burning flesh and linen. At the top of the hill, she saw them, her family. The only people she had ever known, standing around the open pit. The fire hissed as the snow hit it, and in the center of the flames, wrapped in white cloth, was something small, something she had made. The grandfather stood closest, his shadow stretched long against the snow, a Bible open in one hand and a shovel in the other. He was speaking low, in words older than any church Opel had ever heard. Words that didn't sound like prayer. Opel watched as her grandmother threw another handful of salt into the pit, whispering, "The blood must not wander. Something inside her snapped then. The pain, the hunger, the years of silence, they all converged in one sharp instant. She rose to her feet, her body trembling, her breath ragged. "Stop," she said. The word came out cracked, foreign, like her voice didn't recognize itself anymore. Her grandfather turned, startled, his eyes milky and blank, fixed on her with a strange calm. "Go back inside." "Child," he said, "it's done." But Opel stepped closer. "That's mine." The old man's jaw twitched. "Ain't yours. Ain't the Lord's either. It's the blood's. You keep what's clean. You burn what's not." He reached out as if to stop her, but she shoved him back. He fell hard, the Bible spilling open into the snow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Opel plunged her hands into the fire. The heat seared her palms. The cloth crumbled beneath her fingers. She pulled the small body free, clutching it against her chest as the others screamed. Her grandmother lunged forward, grabbing for the child, but Opel struck her away with an inhuman strength born of madness and loss. She ran down the hill, the wind biting at her face, the baby pressed against her heart. The fire behind her dimmed into the dark, the cries fading into nothing. No one followed. She didn't know how long she ran, only that the woods never ended. Her body shook with fever, her breath burned her throat, and the world tilted in and out of focus. But she kept going, her bare feet breaking through ice, her dress torn and soaked with blood. By dawn, she reached the edge of the old highway. By dusk, she collapsed in the snow outside a gas station that had been closed for months. By nightfall, someone found her, the sheriff, who would later tell the paper she was a girl in a wedding dress, carrying her own stillborn child. He never said where she came from. He couldn't, because there was no such place as Pritchard Hollow anymore. The fire that night burned everything. The sheriff who found her was a man named Emmett Lyle, 40 years old, a veteran of the Pacific Front, and one of the few in Breathitt County who still believed in writing things down. He was driving home from his shift when he saw her in the headlights, something white moving against the snow. For a moment, he thought it was a deer. Then the figure lifted its head. Her face was raw with cold, lips split open, eyes unfocused. In her arms, he saw what looked like a bundle of rags. But when he bent down, the rags shifted. He stepped back, breath catching. The child was real, tiny, gray, and still warm. He took her to the station, then to the small clinic in Jackson, but no doctor wanted to treat her. They said she was one of them. When Emmett asked what they meant, they just shook their heads. The mountain folk. One nurse whispered, the ones that never left the woods. He stayed with Opel that night, sat by her bed as the doctor cleaned her wounds and stitched the torn skin along her palms. She never screamed, not once. Just lay there, whispering something over and over. Emmett leaned closer. Don't let them burn him again. She was feverish, slipping in and out of consciousness. But her words clung to him like a curse. The next morning, he went back to the site where she'd been found. There was blood in the snow, small footprints leading off the road, disappearing into the woods. He followed them for half a mile before finding what was left of the fire, a blackened pit, ringed with bone and ash. He filed the report, but no one believed him. The county judge told him to leave it alone. Ain't your business what those Hill families do, he said. Ain't been for 100 years. But Emmett couldn't shake it. He visited Opel every day, bringing her food, talking to her softly like she was something fragile that might shatter under too much light. Slowly, she began to speak again. bits and pieces of her life in the hollow. Names that repeated, faces that blurred together, a family that worshipped its own reflection. She told him about Dalton, about the births, about the pit. And then she said something that made him freeze. "The blood don't end when they die," she whispered. "It moves. It calls." Emmett didn't understand at first. But that night, when he returned home, he found something strange waiting on his porch. A small, linen-wrapped bundle tied with twine. Inside was a handful of ash and a piece of scorched bone. No note, no footprints, just the faint smell of smoke. By the next morning, Opel was gone. The bed empty, the window open, snow blown across the floor like dust in a grave. And though Emmett searched the hills for weeks, no one ever saw her again. Or so they claimed. Because 3 months later, a farmer in Perry County swore he'd seen her standing by the tree line at dusk, barefoot, her dress in tatters, holding something close to her chest. He called out to her, but she didn't move, didn't blink. When he looked again, she was gone, and where she had stood, the snow was black. Spring came late that year. The thaw never reached the hollows, and the roads to Jackson washed out twice before June. Sheriff Emmett Lyle had gone quiet. Drinking too much, sleeping too little, he stopped writing reports altogether. The townsfolk said he'd lost his bearings, but the truth was simpler. He'd seen something the mind wasn't built to hold. The night Opel disappeared, something changed in him. His dog wouldn't go near the porch. The house smelled of smoke that wouldn't fade, no matter how often he scrubbed the walls. Some nights, he'd wake to the sound of humming, a woman's voice, soft and slow, rising from the woods behind his house. He'd light his lantern and walk outside, shotgun in hand, calling her name. Opel. The voice would stop. Then the snow, or later the grass, would shift, as if someone had just stepped out of sight. By the 3rd week, he began finding things again, small handprints on his windows, a wedding veil caught on a fence post, a trail of footprints leading nowhere. One morning, a neighbor found him sitting on his porch steps, eyes fixed on the tree line. His hands were shaking, his lips moving silently. When they asked what he was saying, he told them, "She keeps asking where the baby is." But there was no baby. The body had been buried weeks earlier, marked only by a plain wooden cross behind the clinic. Then, one evening in early summer, Emmett packed his rifle, his lantern, and his notebook, and drove toward the ridge where the old Pritchard land used to be. He told the deputy he'd be back by dawn. He wasn't. They found his truck abandoned on the dirt road, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. The snow around it, yes, snow in June, was stamped with a single set of bare footprints, small as a child's. They led into the trees, winding deeper into the hollow. A search party went out the next day. What they found was worse than silence. The old chapel was still standing, though half collapsed. Inside, the walls were covered in black soot, every inch scrawled with names: Ruth, Dalton, Samuel, Opel, Emmett. At the altar lay his lantern still lit, its glass smeared with blood. Next to it, his notebook, the final page read. The fire never went out. The blood just learned to walk. No one ever found his body. The search was called off after a week, though some say the deputy who led it quit the force and left Kentucky for good. He told his wife, "The ground talks up there. You just can't understand the words." Years passed. The hollow grew wild. The trees reclaimed what was left. But hunters who strayed too deep still spoke of strange lights moving through the fog, of a woman's humming carried by the wind. They said if you followed it, It led you to a clearing where the snow never melted, and where, if you were quiet enough, you could hear the sound of a baby breathing just beneath the earth. Time forgot Pritchard Hollow, but the land did not. Roots twisted over what once were doorframes, and saplings split through the floors of abandoned homes. The chapel's cross leaned sideways, its arms rotted, but no matter how many storms came through, it never fell. By the 1960s, the stories were local folklore, told in whispers over bar counters and campfires. Kids dared each other to walk the ridge at night, to see the bride in the snow. They said she appeared when the wind died, wearing a dress the color of frost, carrying something in her arms. Most never saw her, but some did. In the winter of 1963, a boy named Luther Adams vanished near the old county line. His friends said he'd wandered off after seeing a light moving between the trees. A soft, orange flicker, like a lantern. The search party found his coat 3 miles from where he was last seen, folded neatly over a rock. His footprints continued another few yards, and then stopped, not faded, not covered. Stopped beside them. The snow was melted in a perfect circle, black at the edges, as though something had burned there. His mother swore she saw Opel in a dream, the night before his body was found. Said the woman was cradling a baby, whispering something she couldn't make out. When she woke, her bedsheet smelled faintly of smoke. Through the years, the pattern held. Every few winters, the same story: a traveler goes missing, a child disappears. A hunter finds ash where snow should be, always near the same ridge, always near the hollow that no longer appeared on maps. The few who tried to investigate, historians, journalists, amateur ghost hunters, never stayed long. One, a university folklorist from Lexington, described hearing a heartbeat beneath the soil, faint but steady. He left that same night, abandoning his camera, his notes, and half his equipment. His final recording, found years later, caught a single phrase before the tape ended in static. She's still waiting. The blood keeps her alive. Locals stopped going near the ridge after that. The forest was too quiet there, the air too cold even in summer. And sometimes, when the mist settled low enough, you could see shapes moving through it. Slow, swaying, as though walking in a procession that never ended. Old women said the fire had changed her. That when Opel pulled her child from the pit, she took more than a body. She took its unfinished breath. Something that should have gone out stayed alive inside her, and it fed, year after year, on the memory of the bloodline that made her. Now, they said, the hollow was hers alone. No graves left, no kin, no prayer that could reach her. Only the snow, and what moves beneath it when the night is too still. By the time the 70s came, even the maps had learned to avoid that stretch of Kentucky. The cartographers drew a neat, polite line where the mountains folded and left it blank. No roads, no towns, no hollows. Just a white scar on the page. But in the winter of 1972, a storm tore through Breathitt County, uprooting trees, flooding creeks, revealing things the ground had held hidden for generations. After the thaw, a state survey team was sent to assess the damage. 3 men went up the ridge. Only 2 returned. The one they lost was a man named Richard Kane, a geologist from Frankfort. The others said he'd gone ahead to photograph what looked like a sinkhole. But when they reached it, there was no hole, just a depression in the earth, perfectly circular, as if something enormous had pressed down from above. The snow there was gone, replaced by damp, black soil. In the middle of it lay a single object, a veil, half buried, burned at the edges. When the 2 men turned to leave, the woods went silent. No wind, no birds, no crunch of their own boots. Just silence, thick as ash. And then came a sound soft, distant, like a lullaby hummed through teeth. They ran. The story made it back to town, though the official report never mentioned the veil, nor the singing. The state called it environmental displacement. The locals called it the bride's breath. They said the hollow exhales once every generation, calling back what it lost. And sometimes, if the snow comes early, the smoke returns with it. In 1991, a pair of hikers from Ohio stumbled upon a clearing where no clearing should have been. The trees bent outward, the ground smooth, barren, untouched by decades of growth. One of them, an amateur historian, snapped a Polaroid. When he developed it later, there was a figure in the background, faint, almost transparent. A woman in a long white dress, her face turned away, her hands clutching something small to her chest. He burned the photograph that same night. But before he did, he swore the baby's eyes were open. And now, locals say when the first snow falls over Jackson, if you drive past the old road that once led to Pritchard Hollow, you can see her, standing just beyond the tree line, her veil trailing in the wind, her arms wrapped around something too still to be alive. She never moves. She never blinks. But if you stop your car, if you roll your window down, you might hear her voice, faint but clear, carried on the cold. The fire never went out. The blood just learned to walk. And somewhere in the darkness of those hills, the air still smells of smoke, faint and endless, as if something is still burning beneath the snow.